Hello, Baker International Finance students. Hope everyone is doing well. And during this week, we are actually halfway through the course, so continue plugging along. Good job with the forum discussions. So this week you have a little bit more reading, but I think the reading is manageable. You're going to have chapters 8, 9, and 10. Again, the forum discussion and your homework. And what I would suggest is this is the time of the course to start looking ahead to looking at the final project. So go and look at your syllabus, look at the expectations, start getting some of the research done right now on what you want to research. And I think especially a lot of the application this week, one thing I would suggest is that many of you may never be directly involved in the transactions dealing with decisions with international exposure. But you may be in charge of someone or need to understand what is going on. So I think really, especially this chapter 10 this week is going to be really relevant because it talks about the different types of hedging you can do, and does your firm need to protect itself? How conservative um, are you? That's the job of Treasury management, to tend to lean more on the conservative side, but really understanding what is going on. So you have a good understanding of what type of risks your firm is facing, or the multinational enterprise is facing, and even from investment decisions, what are the risks that other firms are taking on. So, all right, so to start off first this week, Chapter 8 was with interest rate risk and swaps. Talks about the London Interbank Offering Rate. It's kind of a benchmark rate that fluctuates. And when I was kind of reviewing these chapters again, I reread them early this morning because I have to too, expose myself to this once in a while, but I've kept notes on it. A lot of this, the type of personal examples, is we all face different risks. When we buy insurance, we hope that our house does not burn down. But you also might come across decisions that interest rates are really low right now. Do I want to refinance my home to get a lower interest rate? But sometimes they give you an option that if I refinance, I have to pay a large amount of closing cost, or I could get into some type of exposure that I can get a much lower rate now, but it's floating. So a lot of these chapters look at, that firms face those decisions too, just on a corporate level or a multinational enterprise level. I'm trying to save money, reduce my cost to increase my profits, but I have to be cautious because, if I get if you get a low mortgage that's floating, and all of a sudden, interest rates go way up in a few years, even though they're low now, you're exposed to that. So you can't do much about it once those rates keep going up. So the same thing with LIBOR. If LIBOR keeps going up and up and up, right now it's relatively low, but then the firm is faced with that exposure. So that's a lot of what they're kind of reading through in these chapters to think about. So to try to protect it. So obviously with the cost of borrowing, um, they talk about the different types of investment grade versus speculative. I was talking to a colleague that's in my cohort at KU, and he was asking me about, why is Johnson County Community College so concerned about their debt rating? Why does that matter? So I tried to explain that to them. It's more to try to protect themselves to potential future exposures, that if they have to borrow more money, well, if their debt is downgraded, that's going to cost them more to borrow more in the future. When I used to work at Sprint, we used to keep a treasury yield curve, and then we would look at what was the borrowing cost for us at 1 month, at 3 months, at 1 year, at 10 years, and 30 years, and how do we compare? And I think we've said this before in finance. A basis point is 1/100th of 1%. So if you go from a LIBOR 1.25 to 1.50, that's 25 basis points. So we essentially want to know what was our credit risk compared to the risk-free rate of the U.S. Treasury rate. So, all right. So looking at some other things, look in this chapter, obviously the exposure of interest rate risk. We talked about that between the fixed and a floating rate. And they go through like a metastat example. I think it was on page 218. But again, there's a couple things we could look at. We could look at interest rate futures to try to protect, or forward rate agreements. Forward rate, you'd be more locking in. But the one thing I want to remind you about in this chapter is when they're looking at these things, they're basing it on bonds, and bonds again have that present value or inverse relationship. So As interest rates go up, the price of bonds goes down, the present value of bonds goes down. Or as interest rates drop, the present value of those bonds go up. So when you're looking at these ideas like selling the future, you just got to remind yourself about these concerns. So like if you're concerned that interest rates go up, they're actually taking a short position. They're betting that the price of the bonds are going down and interest rates are going to go up. So they may go into like selling a future in order to protect themselves from rising interest rates. Okay. Let's see, the last thing, I just want to talk about like the interest rate swaps in this chapter. Most commonly associated with interest rate payments associated with fixed or floating rate or debt instruments. Essentially, you may be concerned that you have a floating rate and you want to exchange that with a fixed rate. And what the textbook does is they kind of go through some different examples. They did that with, making sure that I could say pay, like they gave the example in the textbook, this was on page 223, to have, the 3.85% for the New York bank at the fixed, plus the 1.25% credit spread. So the new cost would be at 5.1%. But again, you are getting the floating rate back at the 1.885%, what they quote in the textbook. So your true cost is at a 3.215 when I did the math on it this morning. So essentially, you're trying to make sure you protect yourself. You're getting in some type of agreement with that swap dealer. That's really because there's going to be some other party on the other end that would rather have a floating. So it's just bringing those parties together is a lot of what these swap agreements are doing. So, but again, the idea that you're trying to protect yourself from changing interest rates and not be exposed. So you're hedging, if you will, that I don't get caught that my debt expenses are getting more and more eating away at my cash flows. All right, chapter 9 is more of a theory-based FX rate determination. And some of the theories, talks about the relative price of monies, the relative price of goods, the relative prices of bonds. What they're saying is there's not one theory. These theories work together. Like the nuances of these theories, they're things intertwined or interweave within them. But they talked about the parity conditions, the balance of payments approach, the monetary approach, that all of these can influence potential interest rates, exchange rates. And why should we care as someone that has to manage these? Because we can be exposed to these changing. So we want to look at these. We want to try to forecast. We try to understand what's happening. The textbook mentioned technical analysis. I will tell you that fundamentally, most economists and those in the finance profession take this with a degree of uncertainty, because again, you're looking at charts and patterns. And if you believe in efficient market hypothesis, it's saying that a chart can't predict what's going to happen in the future. You have to look at the underlying reasons why. It might help you with some of the trends that are happening. But bottom line, I go back and argue that we got to look at the fundamentals of what's going on in the markets. So, of course, in 9.2, they talk about currency market interventions. Intervention methods can be direct intervention, buying and selling it for exchange, indirect interventions, and capital controls. It just says we're not letting any money come in and out. But you saw some of the case studies that they had in this chapter about the Asian crisis in 97. I like the one example I was reading this morning that they had a speaker after that crisis, and this has been a while. And at the conference, the individual said, well, this is the equivalent of economy of North Carolina. Why should we care? But then the next speaker came up and kind of threw him under the bus a little bit and said, well, yeah, but the population's also, very large, 220 million people. So that impacts a lot of people, because he was kind of saying that, it may not seem large relative GDP-wise, but this is impacting a lot of people, and it does matter. So they also mentioned the example of the Argentine crisis. And, the problem is, that if all of a sudden that these currencies move out of favor, I think I said this before, like money moves like a school of fish. If all of a sudden you are concerned about something in Argentina, all that capital, all that inflow Same with the Asian crisis. You need those capital inflows to come in to support building of new dams, schools, investment. But all of a sudden, if they get spooked and they get scared, they're going to pull that money out, and that's going to hurt your economy. So the bottom line, kind of, it asked a lot of these. The last thing they wrap up about 9.4 and forecasting. And I would say that there are places like Citibanks and other financial institutions that help firms try to predict and let them know what they think is going to happen about exchange rates to try to help guide them. These are paid services, especially large multinational enterprises are probably going to be seeking out the advice from their financial institutions to help them protect themselves and deciding whether they're going to do in the next chapter about different type of hedging strategies, so we hedge or not. The bottom line, it kind of comes to the question, are our markets efficient? So, all right, last thing, chapter 10. I think this is the most important probably chapter for you all taking an international finance course, because bottom line, it comes down to, make sure you're protecting cash flows. How much are you willing to risk? Are there profit alternatives? So we still get into theory too, because some would say the firm shouldn't worry about that because it's the investors, the stockholders, that are making those decisions, and they're willing to take on that risk. But others would say, no, you want to be signing on caution. And especially a lot of what looking at right now with, we think about COVID-19 and the oil markets and how crazy it is right now, is the textbook talked about the translation exposure, on your books. What is that actually worth on that investment or a contract that you have, and ultimately the operating exposure. So like now, a lot of multinational firms, countries like Venezuela, other Russia, Saudi Arabia, they're still being exposed by these oil wars. So it doesn't help anyone. It really is in their best interest to cooperate and work together, but kind of they're punishing each other. We get the benefit of lower gas when we go to the pump, but there's also U.S. firms that invested heavily in drilling, and if the price isn't greater than your average variable cost, it's kind of a shutdown point, so it hurts everyone. All right, so the last section is chapter 10. They talk about the hedging purposes, the pros and cons of that, like do I do nothing? The cons are, there are costs involved of it, because it's an expense. And again, I said the shareholders, the cons would be that, hey, don't worry about it, we're taking this risk. But I would say internally as a treasury manager, you want to try to protect that risk. But the hedging, you're trying to look at the uncertainty of the future. Yeah, I can write it out. And if I have a contract, like the example they mentioned the textbook many times, that I'm supposed to be receiving British pounds. I think it's the Guando firm. They're supposed to get British pounds in the future, maybe 3 months from now or 60 days from now. What happens if all of a sudden the British pounds depreciates in value, or what if it appreciates? It would be to my benefit to make a profit, but if I'm getting less when I exchange for US dollars, that's a concern. So I'm exposed to those exposures. But the main things I want to go through, especially in this chapter they talked about, is they said, you could do a forward hedge. You could lock in that price now and know exactly what it is. You could also do some options, but options cost money. Like I spent $26,000 this option. It's not exercisable, but at least I know I'm going to, doing a put that I can sell these British pounds for dollars going forward. It's guaranteed. It's like insurance. When we buy insurance, a lot of times we're not going to use it for the car insurance, for the home insurance, for life insurance. In fact, they say life insurance, the probability that you're ever going to get a payoff on life insurance is about 2%. But that's why I'm just, this is as an aside, just buy term insurance just to what you cover for your needs. Otherwise, it's not really worth the investment. So you'd be better off investing in other aspects of your personal life. But that's just my opinion, of course. And then, the idea of a money market hedge. With a money market hedge, how that works, we read the textbook, is that what I can do is that I know I'm going to receive these British pounds in the future. So what I could do is I could borrow British pounds now, and I can convert those to US dollars, invest them in US dollars in the United States if I can, and then I would make sure that whatever my loan is due, whatever I'm receiving for the sale of that good in British pounds, it exactly pays off that loan. But the textbook's going to walk through those some different examples and breaking points of like an interest rate, whether it's worth it. But I think bottom line, the example, the forward hedge in the textbook examples was the best bet. But again, it kind of says, do I do anything at all? But probably better off doing some type of hedging. So, okay, well, went a little bit longer this week, so hopefully it gave you some insights to some of your readings this week. Again, if you have any questions, do email me. But otherwise, keep staying safe, and I look forward to reading your forum discussions online. And you guys have a great week and take care.